Thank you, Don, for the nice introduction, and it's good to see some old friends in the audience, and I hope some new ones. As you heard, I have spent my whole career working on Africans in Latin America, and it was sort of serendipity. I was going to be a Brazilianist like Marshall Eakin, who's a hard act to follow, and he'll be here in a little bit. But I found these wonderful records in the University of Florida, where I went to graduate school, that they had been collecting for 20 years or more, all around the Spanish Caribbean, from Mexico, Cuba, actually some of South Carolina and Georgia as well. And that sort of sidetracked me into a different project, which was my first book, called Black Society in Spanish Florida. And most people didn't even care about Florida. It was off the map in terms of Latin America. If you didn't do Mexico or Peru or Brazil, you weren't doing anything important. And if you were doing North America, you stopped at Charleston, basically. So Florida was off the map, and I just had the good fortune to get connected to a wonderful archaeologist who became part of my committee, and I was able to do the history for a wonderful runaway slave community of runaway slaves from Carolina and Georgia who ended up running into Florida. And I thought, what in the world? Why are they going to Florida? And in researching that, I went all the way back to the early history that I'm going to share with you today. But it came out of the very different, experiences of slavery in what we're more familiar with. North American slavery or English world slavery is quite different than what was happening all across the Spanish Americas. And so that's why slaves were running from South Carolina and Georgia and heading for Spanish Florida in the south. And so after doing a lot of the research, we were able to get money from the Black Caucus of the Florida legislature and do a really nice archaeological dig there with my mentor who had helped me so much. And now, 20 years later, there's a little museum at the site. The excavation was done, the history was done. We worked on the public history angle of it, preparing materials for fourth graders, which is where you get Florida history, and then finally the money for the museum. So if you ever go to St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest city in what is today the United States, Fort Mose that I worked on originally is right to the north of the city a little bit, and it's worth a visit. It's a really beautiful little museum, and the community has embraced it and adopted it, and they do recreations of the English attack on the place, and everybody has a shootout, and it's good fun. So if you have a chance, see that. And then this is how I came to think about, well, there were people at this site from Cuba, from Mexico, people from Colombia. There were Indians integrated into that world as well, and there were Spanish as well. And so I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, and I started going out in all the other directions, and that's why I'm working now in places like Colombia and Brazil and Cuba and Ecuador and many other places, but always I'm looking for the long African past there in those places, and so that's why Don mentioned those books that I'm working on. So maybe I ought to get started with our slideshow. Will you please just pop in if you have a question at any time, very informal, and we'll see how the time goes, and then if we have time at the end, I can do some more things. Oh, and one other little thing. If anybody's interested in one other little project, over the years, finding records for these people has been something Flo has helped me with on this project, to get the Vanderbilt Library to help support and preserve the oldest black records in the hemisphere for Africans, and it turns out Indians, Chinese, anybody not Spanish ends up in these records. And so we started off with a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to do Brazil and Cuba, and Paul was my first supporter, actually, because that was the first grant. And then when Paul left us, bereft, then Flo stepped in and helped me. And each time I got some money, they were part of it, because they wrote letters of support to say that Vanderbilt's library would help preserve these records in perpetuity. And so we started with Brazil and Cuba, and then I'm now running projects in Colombia. I go there tomorrow at 6 a.m. to close down one of those projects. And we got some money finally from the Catholic Church to start doing the same kind of work in St. Augustine, where I started my whole career, and where there are the oldest records for what is the United States. They date from the 16th century. So pretty soon we'll have those up too, and if anybody's interested, it's all on Vanderbilt's website. Of course, they're in the original. Is that me? Sorry, it's my arm. It's all in the original Spanish or Portuguese, as the case may be, but we're starting to hire grad students now to transcribe some of the records. I'm sorry, what am I doing? It's my necklace. Oh, I'll stick that under here. And we'll finally get some of those in transcription in English. But a lot of things we also preserve visually, at least, are artifacts that we find in the churches and so on. So maybe you'll be interested. If you are, you may grab one of those. Okay, so on to Spanish Florida. Marshall, I saw his beautiful slideshow, which set up the whole African cultural sending areas, the Middle Passage, the numbers. I'm not even moving. What is that? Okay, even inside. All right, there we go. Oh, thank you. Well, forgive me. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm standing as still as possible. But anyway, what is that? That sounds better. Okay. Well, Marshall came in right on cue. I was just saying what a great job he did on setting everybody up for the big picture, as he is always good at. And now I'm going to narrow it down a little bit, still be pretty big, about Spain and the Spanish Americas. Did that do that when you were doing this? My hair. Well, I can't take that off. All right. Well, I'm sorry, and I hope you bear with me. Okay. So Marshall laid out our plan last week for you, and I appreciate that he covered while I was off at a conference, actually, on Africans in the Americas. And so this is our second meeting, and I'm doing slavery in Spanish America. So to back up to Spain, I wanted to set the stage for why there is such a difference in the way slavery is enacted in the British colonies, French and Dutch colonies, and the Spanish world. And it dates back to the early history of Spain, when the Muslims from North Africa swept into Spain in 711 and swept all the way up past the Pyrenees. And eventually there's a long 700-800-year war by the old Christians, as they called themselves, to drive the Muslims southward ever, and finally to expel them in 1492 back to North Africa. And so all of the time in which Muslims were in the Spanish peninsula, or the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal both had the same experience. Different laws, different cultures, different languages, different everything were there. So we had a mix in those years of Muslim, Christians, and Jews interacting often when the wars stopped periodically, because you can't fight 800 years nonstop. There are periods of convivencia, they call it in Spain, in which these groups live together in communities and have trade and commerce and intermarry. And a wonderful new book, if anybody's interested, has come out in the last several years called All Can Be Saved by the wonderful historian Stuart Schwartz, which sort of debunks the black legend that we all think of when we think of Spain, in which inquisitions burned people every day in the square. Well, that wasn't the case. There were periodically these show trials, auto da fes and burning, yes, but most of the time there was at least some toleration among these different groups. And so during that long time period, Spanish people actually adopted many of the Muslim traditions, and some of that is Muslim law that gets worked back into Spanish law. Some of it is Arabic language. Any Spanish words starting AL, you'll find are a heritage of that long period, and also the wonderful architecture, all the beautiful things that are reproduced in St. Augustine, for instance, trying to look like Muslim palaces and so on. So this is a couple of slides here to try to help us remember that long period of coexistence and of religious cultural mix. And on the left is a picture of an enslaved woman from the chess book, actually, of Alfonso X, a 13th century Spanish monarch. You can see that the slave is lighter skinned than the owner, and that sort of gets my point across. And the other picture shows an aftermath of one of the military conquests in which the Muslims have won. Their sub-Saharan African allies are driving away the Christian captives along with the other booty of cattle and sheep. And so I'm trying to use these images to get us to think about what is different in this Spanish world. And it is because Muslims had a system of slavery that was not based on race, and the Spanish adopt that same system, and that's what's so different about the Spanish and the Anglo worlds on this side of the water as well. So slavery is an accident of war. You're captured and not killed. And later, as the Spanish rework that system, they will eventually codify the law in the 13th century. Once they've started to regain most of Spain, Alfonso X, known as El Sabio, or the Wise One, writes a whole code of Spanish law that's going to be applied later in the New World as well. And in it, it specifies slavery is a consequence of just war, which is interpreted as religious war, and it is not based on race. That's the big message probably of today. And it is not perpetual. You can come in and out of it. Am I okay?
We're going to get you back here, Jane.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of the picture.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
Just to use the lectern. We're going to mute that and let you use it.
Okay.
So I think it's going to work
Better? Actually, something had stopped making that weird noise. I don't know what I did differently, but okay. Can I sort of aim it this way so I can stand here? I feel like I'm a talking head over the podium. Okay. So not race-based, not perpetual. It's a fluid system. You come into it either captive as a war captive. You can sell yourself into slavery if you're poverty-stricken, and that's your best option. You can sell your children into slavery if that's their best option. And the state can condemn you for high crimes, treason or something else. But it's not perpetual, so there are ways out. And if you have become a slave and you've earned money on your many, many Catholic feast days, you may buy yourself out. Your owner can manumit you out as an act of Christian charity, for instance, on his deathbed or her deathbed or any other time. And the state can also free you for good services, and that is often military services. So you can go into slavery in a variety of ways and come out as often as you go in. And it's a mixed group of slaves. So in some of the materials that I've looked at, I've found, for instance, on this side of the water even, this old system comes over here. I found a Spanish man assigned to perpetual slavery on the works, public works in Havana because he had murdered his wife. And I thought, oh, well, they'll let him off. No, 10 years later, he was still sawing on that wood at the castle of El Moro in Havana. Along with him, and in the galleys where slaves rode, there were mixed race people also. So gypsies, Jews, Muslims from Fez and Algeria and other places. I found in a ship of 140 galley slaves rowing, only 2 people of African descent. So it gives you the idea that it's a very mixed picture until later down the road a piece when we're going to institute plantation slavery and especially sugar. And at that point it'll shift into large-scale plantation agriculture, horrible, 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 being stuck in the sugar fields. But in the same time, in urban cities all over, in urban places or cities all over Latin America, this older medieval tradition persists on till the 19th century, till the U.S. took Florida. That's what you found in St. Augustine, okay? So people are people. They're not chattel, they're not a desk, and they're not a cow or a pig. They're a real person with human feelings and souls to save, okay? And they do try to save those souls. The Christian church was another way in which slavery is different in the Spanish and the Anglo worlds. The Christian church incorporated everybody they could. Doesn't mean they loved everybody equally or they didn't have racial prejudice sometimes, but they incorporate everybody. And so in the old world, it would have been they'd try to convert Muslims and Jews and Africans. This man is in Spain in the 13th century being baptized into the Catholic faith by a Catholic priest with Spanish godparents. And these old church records turn out to be the best because they're long serial records. I'm not moving. And they are sacramental, so you're not supposed to get rid of them. And that's why I'm able to track these old church records that I told you about in that project. So the Catholic faith turns out to be one source of solace and some amelioration of the slave condition for people in the Catholic world. Okay, and just to remind you, I know Marshall had some good maps up, but here's another one to show you how Spain launches out once they've expelled the Muslims in 1492. They take Columbus up on his pitch, and they go out into the Atlantic world. Portugal had preceded them, and so Portugal is focusing primarily down the African coast to go around the southern tip and head east to Asia, which is where they're all trying to get to because of Marco Polo's tales of the wealth that he saw there. So everybody's headed really for the Spice Islands, but the Spanish believed Columbus that he could go westward, and it would be a short hop, skip, and a jump to the same place, and he didn't realize he was going to hit the Americas on his westward route. So here's a big world map that shows you Spain and Portugal and all the places in which they were interested. And in all those places, even once Spain takes the Philippines, for instance, and establishes the Manila galleons and begins to bring things back there, Africans are in all those places in many, many different roles. And so that's another thing to think about. Okay, the first place that Columbus sets up shop, actually, after exploring the Caribbean, is Hispaniola, which is today's Dominican Republic and Haiti. And so that becomes the headquarters of the whole Spanish enterprise in the New World. And there's a very early map there that I showed you. They start to make a little fortified city, eventually down on the southern coast, Santo Domingo. The first settlements on the north coast were bad luck. La Navidad was the first, and Columbus left some men behind because his ship was in trouble and wrecked, and he only had 2 to go back with. When he came back, those men were dead, and another settlement also failed, and they end up making permanent settlement in the south. And that's Diego Colón's, his son's palace, if you will, where the government was run. And from Hispaniola, everybody launches out exploring into other parts of the Caribbean and making claims for the Spanish government. They based those claims on the right that they had planted a flag, they had named things, and Columbus went back, and the Spanish Pope assigns this part of the New World to Spain. Portugal protested, and eventually the line is redrawn enough to get Brazil into the Portuguese sphere, and eventually Portugal will establish Brazil. But first we have the Spanish in. And from launching out from Hispaniola to all the Caribbean islands and then on to Mexico, the big conquest, Africans were part of all that exploration and conquest. So I have looked everywhere I can for any images or texts related to those. It's like hen's teeth finding them, but they're there. And this man is a man named Juan Gotti, who appears as always in the imagery at the side of Cortez with Doña Marina, also the translator. And he was from West Africa. He had gone to Lisbon. He eventually finds his way to Seville and gets on board with some of the explorers and is a part of all of these explorations and conquests of the local Indian populations. So he was in Hispaniola first, Puerto Rico second, Cuba third, He hits Florida with Ponce de Leon in 1512, and next thing you know, he's off with Cortez to conquer the Aztec Empire. For all those things, he has gained honor and credit with the Spanish world and gets military rewards in terms of payments and jobs and land, and we can track his records for a long time. And I don't think you'd find that, I'm sure, I know not, you would not find that in the English, Dutch, French records of the same period. Now, I had them as Africans as allies, but Africans who were then introduced later to Espanola, for instance, to work in the brand new sugar industry, are not going to like it, and they're going to rebel against it, as we all would. It's terrible labor, and pretty soon Africans are running away from those. Diego Colón's sugar plantation is the first known slave revolt in 1521, and so the word for a runaway in Spanish is cimarrón, and so from that we get the English word maroon, meaning a runaway slave. And so Espanola is the first slave revolt, and the Spanish are very fearful because they think all of the Africans on that revolt were Muslims, which I think they could have been because they're coming in as Wolofs from the Senegambia region, and probably were. But it could have also just been the fear of the Spanish, because at the same time that this revolt is going on in the New World, in the Old World there are Mediterranean wars still against the Muslims, and they have an idea perhaps that this could be a global jihad or something. On the right is another figure of these Maroons who is from the 1540s, 20 years down the road. We still have ongoing war in Espanola, and they call it the Maroon Wars. There's lots of paper trail when any empire has to mount a military expedition, and that's why we can track Maroons in particular, because they cost the Spanish crown effort, money, lives. And in all of those cases that I'll look at, and we'll hopefully see, they would rather just crush them. That would be their first option. If they cannot, and they could not in most cases, then they will treat with these with these African rebels, make a treaty, and many cases it implies something like you would have had in the Muslim world. I agree not to fight you anymore. I submit. That was the principle, submission. And in return, I will not practice any heathen faiths. Spain will allow all these people to run their own show, to be natural leaders of their own places, sometimes like new dynasties in those places. And they agreed to become Catholic. So they become military allies, Catholic converts, and in return they get to stop fighting and have their own land and their own government, basically. And they always say they'll be allies of the Spanish against any other enemies, European or Indian, and also that they'll assist in other ways like rescuing shipwreck victims.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
So where did the labor for the plantations come from at that point?
Oh, it doesn't mean everybody got away. There's still plenty of people under the whip on the plantations. It takes, if you have family, you probably don't run. So that's one of the constraints. If you're elderly or ill, you don't run. So these men, as you can see from this image, which is, not based on anything we know, are prime life, strong men, military warriors possibly before they came to the New World. And so it has to take the strong. There's been some archaeology done of some of those early Maroon sites in Hispaniola, which also tell us about the cultures and the practices at those places. Even if we didn't have text, we could find some things. And you can see that they were ironsmiths, and there's a religious association with ironsmithing in Africa. Lemba, that I showed you, Lemba was the founder of Congo, Angola, and a blacksmith himself. Of Congo, and a blacksmith himself. So the idea of founding a settlement as a blacksmith was something that came across the waters, and they're making iron objects. The shell was to blow messages across mountainous spaces. And everywhere the Spanish went and started new settlements and tried to get plantation systems up and going, or mining up and going, another brutal labor, slaves ran, and they formed marooned communities in all these different places, and there's a long paper trail as a result. So I put up a couple of them. In Colombia, and actually the reason we have all these statues today is because African populations in all those places have begun to revive their history. Often the Spanish world is cast as Spanish and Indian, right? And you never used to hear about Africans there. But the African identity movement basically is hitting Latin America as well, and people are now looking for that history and restoring it with monuments and projects of that sort. So we have on your left, Bencos Biojo, who was one of the very early slave leaders of a big maroon community called San Basilio in Cartagena, outside Cartagena, Colombia. People still go and study this very isolated place for the linguistic novelty. They've got a language of their own called Palenquero. A palenque was also a maroon community, another word for a stockaded and protected place. So these people have been living so far in the boondocks for so long that they've maintained a lot of their original language, mixed it in with other Spanish and so on, so people study that. Then we have on the top, you have Yanga, it's sometimes spelled with an Ñ, who is one of the famous maroon leaders of Mexico in the same time period, and Yanga's town is now the site of celebration and memorials in Mexico. Again, these people tend to be coastal people because that's where sugar works, and that's where plantations are in the low sugar coasts, where a lot of Africans end up. And then the gentlemen on the bottom are very famous because they were portrayed in this wonderful oil portrait from 1599. Maroons who were destined for slave work in the mines of Potosi in Peru, modern-day Peru, but modern-day Bolivia, called Upper Peru then. And the boat wrecked on the coast of Ecuador, and they escaped and form alliances with the Indians there. And they're so fierce, the Spanish tribe, repeatedly to get rid of them and cannot. So again, that pattern of making a treaty, settling the peace, and writing down all the privileges, basically, of that treaty. These are the Zambo chieftains, the title says. A Zambo means a person who has one African, one indigenous parent. Okay, and these men formed a dynasty on the coast at a town they shaped called Esmeraldas, and to this day you can go there. It's very African. And this painting was sent back to the King of Spain to show him who are his new allies. But they also eventually, Spain is a small country with a small population and a huge empire, as I showed you on those maps. How are they going to first conquer it? How are they going to hold it? They're thin, so they always will be incorporative. It was their pattern anyway from the old world, and so in both urban and rural settings you'll find Indians and Africans and Chinese later all being part of the Spanish world. And in this case, they'll often make the African groups, more so than anybody else, but some Indian groups too, are formed into militias who have their own leaders, are paid for their services, and eventually that becomes a formal system in the 18th century. But it's always from the beginning black allies in military functions with arms, siding with the Spanish. And so indigenous people consider them Spanish because they come with the Spanish and they're fighting for them. And here's some interesting, we have wonderful maps and illustrations and designs of engineering plans and so on saved in the Spanish archives. So they were very, very good record keepers, and all over that empire, that vast empire, things are generated and sent back to the Archive of the Indies in Sevilla, Spain today. And that's where I work a lot to find them, but it's wonderful now. They have put this up online, and it's a Spanish website called Pares, P-A-R-E-S, and you can search it quite easily and find things like these wonderful designs of the costumes and the drawings of forts and so on. So on your left, there is an 18th century image of military troops from Havana, Cuba, and Veracruz, Mexico. In the middle is a 17th century image from Panama. And on the right is an 18th century image from Santo Domingo, what became the Spanish side of the island, today the Dominican Republic. But again, you could find troops in Manila like this with their Spanish outfits. These men served on land most of the time, but also the Spanish Navy is manned by people of what they call broken color, which is sort of a pejorative, but it means not Spanish purely. It's more like a casta idea. But they get military commissions on the sea as well as corsairs and privateers, and they get their divide of the loot when they're lucky, and they get caught when they're not. And so they share the fate of the Spanish on those ships as well as on land. Now, not everybody has a military career. There are so many other things that Africans do in every niche of society of the Spanish world, from the horrible plantation slavery, which we'll do a little bit more with later. Certainly when we get to Brazil, we'll show you a lot of sugar plantations. In the beginning, those are not up and going, and we have a big urban setting in which also African domestic slavery happens. In this case, these people were musicians, a wonderful color image that we had from 17th century Trujillo in Peru. But musicians were prized and sometimes end up circling around the Atlantic on ships and getting picked up by different governors and so on. You can see the influence of the African instruments there, the marimba there. That big gourd-looking thing, I've seen things like that in Senegal. They're a little different, but that might be. You can see the gentleman smoking his pipe. They already had the custom of tobacco from those exchanges on the African coast as well. And shakers and other kinds of instruments. So these are one of the ways in which we can see, the influence of African musicians in current-day Spanish-American music. Again, sort of coastal. We're in a coastal regime where it's more heavily African. If you go up into the highlands of the Andes, for instance, you already have a diminished but still very large population of indigenous people. If you go into any of the Andean regions, you'll see fewer Africans, but they're there. And in central Mexico, you'll see fewer Africans, but they're there. But anywhere coastal is heavily African. As a result of Africans coming with the first waves, from the minute they come, there's already intermixture of African, European, and Indian groups and family formations out of that. And the Catholic Church was quite fine with it. They would rather you be married than live in sin. So they were, Queen Isabella from the beginning was saying, get these people married. They're already living together and having children. Let's get them married, and the children will be legitimate then, so they will have no problems in later life. So marriage was the norm, what they wanted for everybody. It doesn't mean everybody does it, but it does mean that at least from the beginning there are mixed families. And later the Spanish in Mexico get sort of interested in this when it's a time of scientific observation and documentation, and people are traveling around drawing flora and fauna and things like that. They're also drawing these mixed race families because it was something of interest back in Europe, especially when you mix Indian with African and so on. So there's a whole series of these paintings called casta paintings, which demonstrate the huge intermixture of all these families. But I can also track it in our church records, of course. Sacramental records will always be very clear about who's marrying whom, whether they're free or enslaved. If they are still enslaved, they'll tell us who were the owners. They'll always have godparents, so you can begin to figure out networks of friends and kin. And in the case of Africans and Indians, they will always tell you as specifically as they possibly can what ethnic group they belong to. So these records are very interesting in terms of tracking the slave route, which starts up in the hump in Senegambia, moves down into West Africa, and then to Central Africa. You'll see different people with different customs, different languages, different religions, and we can track that through our church records as well as through the wonderful database that Marshall showed you the link for. But I have to say that they miss most of the early Spanish and Portuguese world. They pick up in good strength when it gets more English, and they're trying to fill in more of the older records. But I wanted to show two pictures here because one is an urban family. It looks pretty comfortable, a Spanish father, Indian wife, and mixed-race child. In the rural areas, there is a sugar image for you, actually, in Mexico. And you can see the sugar works in the back and the sugar cane there ready for somebody to shove it through those grinders. And in the front, an African slave from that plantation, his Indian wife. And in the background, an African muleteer taking some of that product to be sold on the coast. So mixed urban and rural populations. Okay, so a summary, and then I'll take, I'm not sure if I've been talking too fast or too slow. How are we doing on time? We have 5 more minutes? 20. Oh, okay, I can slow down a lot. Oh, I went too fast. I'm sorry. All right, well, let's sum up, and then I'll maybe lecture a little bit more and take questions. So here are our big messages. Africans from the beginning are incorporated into Spanish society, free and enslaved, okay, along with everybody else. From the beginning, they're on those ships of exploration. They take the same risks as the Spanish. Sometimes that gains them money and titles. Most often it doesn't, but at least it gets them a paper trail, and we can track them from then on. They become very good interpreters. When I worked in Spanish Florida, for instance, I found shipwrecked Africans who had been coming from Mexico and Peru. They were headed back to Spain. Ships wreck. The survivors straggle onto the beaches. The Indians often killed the Spaniards and gathered what they could of the shipwrecks, and they sometimes leave alive Africans for some reason. And so some of the Africans that I've encountered in 1520s to 60s on the Florida coast were survivors of shipwrecks. By that time, they'd lived a long time among the indigenous populations and picked up all the languages and cultural protocols. And when the Spanish finally make discovery, so-called, of Florida in 1512, they're greeted hostilely. And it may be that those Africans warned them, this is not a good thing when those Spanish ships come up. At any rate, many failed explorations and attempts to settle Florida don't come to fruition until 1565. And then we start to get Spanish records, and then that's when I found my shipwreck victims who had lived all that time among Indians. And the same thing happens when Cortez gets to the Yucatan. He finds Africans and Spaniards who had been shipwrecked and were living among the indigenous people. That's a real asset because they know everything about the language, the politics, warfare, and so on. And so Cortez tried to bring these people back in, and one of them says, no, I'm not. I'm staying with my Indian family. I won't come back. And he waged war against the Spaniards for the next 20, 30 years of his life. In my case, in Spanish Florida, several of the Africans were incorporated by Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who's the first settler or founder of Spanish St. Augustine. And he puts them on a military payroll and uses them as translators for all his Indian treaties. So in all these places, the Spanish figure out Africans who especially came from the West Coast have already had to deal with a lot of different languages on the trade on the West African coast. People have drawn linguistic maps of the area which show sometimes only 200 people speak that language. And so it's a very multilingual place already they come from. And you may know that as you learn a language when you're little, a foreign language, it's much easier than when you try to learn it as an adult. And they study the wiring and say, yes, you can add on other layers of other languages if you've got it early, if it's wired early. So West Africans, I would argue, already had a proficiency in language, and when they come to this world, they can add in new Indian languages easier than an adult Spaniard could. And so they often are filling those roles as translators. Now, a translator walks a fine line. You're translating, how accurately do you do that? Do you see a chance for escape maybe sometimes? When we had Spanish explorations through our world of the southeast here, I've tracked many who ran away from those expeditions and instead chose to live with Indians. And so the Juan Pardo expedition comes all the way up here, and I don't know if anybody peeled off from his expedition, but they certainly did from the Hernando de Soto expedition, the Coronado expedition in the southwest. So Africans were always with them, and sometimes they stay and side with the Spanish, but other times they bail and go off to the indigenous group, where again they're going to make a difference, aren't they? From Espanola, they actually tried a very early failed settlement in South Carolina called San Miguel de Gualdape, and it included Africans and Spaniards, and they got trapped in the politics of the uprising of the indigenous people, and many Africans ran and were off with the Indians that time. So even before we have a permanent settlement in the U.S. of Spanish people, we have Africans who stayed behind. So it's a very interesting and sporadic, but somehow it must be culturally important that they were there. So Africans are even preceding the Spanish to the New World as permanent settlers. That was that point. And we've already discussed military allies. I see generations following in that same military tradition, grandfathers, fathers, sons, because of the different way they looked at military in that world as well. It's a corporation. Everything in Spanish world is organized corporately. And so your church is a corporation, your parish. Your town is a corporation. Your university is a corporation. Your guild of shoemakers or ironsmiths or anything else, a corporation. And military is a corporation. And there are special rights and privileges if you belong to corporations of some kind and you're on a list and everybody knows you. In the military case, it means you will never be tried in a civil trial. Only military peers will ever try you. It also means you're exempted from payments that are considered demeaning by the Africans, payments of tribute, like conquered people have to pay, like the Indians had to pay. And so there are benefits that way. There's sometimes pay and often land as a payment. And so you can see why families took that route and also gained a certain amount of honor and distinction for it. And even the women of those families gain, because if the father, the husband, had a military title and did something for Spain, I'm sorry I'm not looking over here because I feel like I'm bound, but questions I'll break free at last. The women also had privileges to grants from their military service of their husbands, so that's good. We talked about a lot of different types of domestic slavery, but I also made a mention earlier and want to return to the point that in the Catholic world there were many, many, many feast days and saints' days and Catholic holidays in which enslaved people were allowed to work on their own time and at any sort of, honest labor that they wanted to do. So in all these places I find Africans with small economies of their own. They might be raising pigs and selling it. They might be raising chicken. They might be doing laundering. They might be being a butcher on the side on their off days. They might be doing any kind of labor, guiding people, carrying mail, whatever it might be, in the cities, providing water and other services. So they had a way to earn money on their own time, and by Roman law, which is Spanish law and Portuguese law later, that was called a peculium. It was their own private property, could not be taken by their owner. It was theirs. And slowly but surely, they could save money and earn enough to buy themselves out. And there was a very interesting system where you could say, I want to be free. If the owner says, okay, you work it out. If the owner doesn't want to, the courts would hear both sides, the slave and the master, and they would come to an agreement about the cost of that slave, and that slave could put a certain amount down, a down payment, and from that moment the master could not control him as long as he continued to make his payments. It's a system called coartación, and it means the master's rights are cut at that moment, and everybody's recorded it in the books, and that man or woman are on the way to freedom as soon as they pay. As soon as they pay, they get a document that says you have all the rights and privileges of a free person, and God be with you. Now, everybody in the community knew they were a slave earlier, but if they were a good, honorable person and had connections to the community, they go on to have free lives. Some go on to become slave owners themselves. And that's something also that always seems counterintuitive, but it isn't if you don't think of it as a racial thing and you think of it as a system where, you will eventually maybe be the godparent of that slave and maybe help them to freedom too. So on the many holidays you could earn your money. There were other ways also slaves could earn money. If an owner agreed to allow a slave to go work somewhere else for wages, the slave, he or she, would only have to return to the master the agreed upon sum. Anything extra they could keep. So that was another hiring out system that worked. In both those ways, slaves earned peculium with which to buy their freedom. And they also, even as enslaved people, kept cows and horses and did plantings and gardens of their own and used their skills on their own time to earn money. Okay, poor plantation slaves had fewer options because they're not near cities where you can hire yourself out. They don't have a cash economy nearby. They can sort of do an underground economy, maybe trade things here and there, but they aren't going to have the same opportunities for legal freedom that someone in a city might have. And so if you're desperate and it's horrible work and you have no way to legally become free, that's why there are so many rebellions and revolts on plantations. It's the only way you get out. You either run to the mountains as Maroons, or you try to get everybody to fight their way out in a slave rebellion. Yes?
I mean, in Spanish Florida, of the slaves who ran away from the plantations in Georgia and South Carolina and fled Florida, to what extent did they become a part of the Seminole tribes, or, on the other hand, form bands of their own?
Okay, that's right up my alley, thank you. Many of the early slaves that I looked at were running to St. Augustine because they were urban people and they got religious sanctuary there. That's how I worked out that idea for the little museum that I talked about. They went to the Spanish governor and they said, we want to become Catholic. Those nasty Protestants up in South Carolina and Georgia won't let us. And so the governor frees them eventually and makes a town. Now, not everybody went to St. Augustine. Some ran from those nasty slave owners in South Carolina and Georgia and ended up heading for the Indian lands to the interior. The Spanish and the Seminoles, which were formerly the Creek Indians who moved southward into Spanish Florida, they were allies of the Spanish, and so Africans end up in the Seminole world also doing the same things for them that they were doing for the Spanish. They are interpreters, they form armies for them, they intermarry with them, they form mixed race families, they're diplomats, and since you ask, I hope it doesn't sound shameful to say that my last book was Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolutions, and there's a big chapter in there on the Spanish Seminoles and the Black Seminoles, as well as some of these other areas. So yes, Black Seminoles were a very important part of the Seminole Nation and formed part of the treaty arrangements at the end. Many of them have to go west with the Seminoles to Oklahoma and Texas. Some decide that's not a good option and go on to Mexico because they knew they'd worked with the Spanish here in Florida, and so they form themselves into towns in Mexico. And there was an Underground Railroad meeting of the National Park Service last year in St. Augustine, and I went to talk about my stuff. And the Black Seminoles came back from Mexico and speaking perfect Spanish in their boots and their hats, and they'd been cowboys all that time. And then there were others who came from South Carolina and Georgia who'd lost a lot of their culture. But
Did they also form communities or towns that were all black?
yes, they did. In the Seminole world, you mean? Yes. So if you're familiar with Florida, there's a little town called Micanopy, Florida, right south of Gainesville, Florida. Micanopy was a major Seminole chief. His major diplomat, African ally, was a man named Abraham. Abraham ruled his own town next to Micanopy's, and it was called Pilaclicaja, and there's archaeology done there, and it was Abraham about whom I wrote in that book. So they do, but they're all allies, and they do military training, and they are a very forceful part of that war. Yes, sir.
Is it not true that many, I won't say many, but some Africans became Seminole chiefs, and also that the Seminoles to this day have not surrendered to the United States?
It is true that they never signed a peace treaty, and the Seminoles have a sort of dysfunctional relationship with people who claim to be black Seminoles. The Seminoles erased the black Seminole history basically in the period of Jim Crow because they didn't want to be, as many other Indian groups did too, the Lumbees in North Carolina and others. The Creeks have ejected African descended people from their tribal unit. The Seminoles did it, the Cherokee did it. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court backed their definition of those people as slaves, and they weren't. That's what I've proven. They came in the same time the Seminoles did, and they were not slaves. The Seminoles did own slaves that they purchased or that they were gifted, but the other people came as allies. And so, again, it's not race-based because they're free people and slaves. But there were never any chiefs per se, but Osceola's mother was said to be of African descent, so he would have been a Zombo by Spanish terminology. And he was one of the fiercest warriors of the Seminoles in the Third Seminole War. The Seminoles fought 3 major wars. Andy Jackson burned them out the first time in 1817. The second war is in 1835, and the last one runs right up to the Civil War. And they were so fierce that they never were defeated, but treaties were eventually signed as they were getting into these horrible little reservations in the middle of Florida with nothing. They decided it's better to go out west and try it there. But some went to Mexico. Yes, sir.
What happened to the plantation?
Can I move now? I don't know if I can move.
What happened to the plantations after a slave revolt? Did the slaves try to run the plantation, or were they just closed down?
That's a great question. The only place I know where the slaves actually successfully took a country and ran it for a while was Demerara in the Dutch areas of Guyana today. And they drove out the Dutch for 6 months. The Dutch went back up into the Caribbean, got some resources, and came back and took it back. But they could have run it, but it was not going to make sense because no white planter is going to let you do that and not try to take it back from you and get a big army to come against you. They couldn't let that example stand. They had to retrieve it, or else there would be no plantation system. So they could have physically and intellectually and every other way, but the white planter establishment would have gotten rid of it. Yes?
Under the system you've described, to what extent, if any, did the families who held slaves feel responsible for their care? Did they feed them, and did they have any kind of medical care if they needed it?
Well, you know, at the risk of sounding like some kind of an apologist for slavery, which I am not, there were certain expectations, and if you live in a city and people are monitoring you, or in a little town like St. Augustine, yes, there is supervision of all of that, and any slave could run and report abuse. There were requirements about food and health and clothing and so on, even for slaves. And in my first book, though, I wanted to point out that even though slaves know they can run to St. Augustine, that doesn't mean abuse doesn't happen. And sometimes it's sexual abuse. I wrote about a case of a woman being sexually abused by her owner, and she gets told that she's being sold off to be a wet nurse in Havana the next day, say goodbye to your children. And he could not have done that. They would not have allowed that, the Spanish, but she believed him and took each of her children and jumped in a well, and the children die, and she doesn't. So I had a long legal case about that. So abuse happens, but also you see very many cases of the government, when it's reported, intervening, removing slaves from the owner that had been abusive, placing them elsewhere. That's if you've got access to a court, somebody to report to, a priest or a governor or somebody. But if you're out there in the middle of a sugarcane field somewhere, or deep in a mountain somewhere and mining, who are you going to report to? It's sort of like those poor women in the military who can't report their rapes because it's their superior. You know? Is this a follow-up then? Yeah, and then, yes, please.
So, under the societies you described, the slaves actually had more recourse than they did in this area.
Yes. Because they can give testimony, they have voice in the courts. If they cannot write, and many could not, they can mark an X, and there will be 2 witnesses who testify to that. If they're testifying in court, they're allowed to hear the testimony read back and amend it in any way. Women could also do that, and in many places, even European-descended women could not testify in the courts. And yet slave women can testify. They can write straight to the King of Spain. And I see enslaved women that you think would be the doubly disempowered, maybe I'm too close, writing letters of protest and reports or petitions for help of some sort to the king. And every governor has to send it on up the chain. It can take like 9 years to get your answer, but they can be read, and they are required to forward it. And so that gives us a great paper trail. So in legal records, in complaints, in religious records, in property records, all sorts of ways we can find. Children even are a little harder to find in their voice, but sometimes if they're the age of reason and they've been baptized, they might testify also. And in the back?
Could you explain a little bit more about the sugarcane plantation and why that work was any more arduous than any other?
Okay. How many have seen sugar cane in the fields? Okay. Well, sugar cane grows like this big, tall sugar cane. You can't even get through it. And your tools would have been a machete, a big hacking instrument, and that's it. And in the hot blazing sun, when the sugar juice comes up in the cane, you got to cut it right then, or else the owner loses everything. So they worked horrible hours in the blazing sun, hacking through these forests of sugar cane. Snakes and rats and other things occupy that space, and they're there for as many hours as they can stand up. And then women often carried the cut cane on their head to that mill that I showed you in one of the images. People had to shove it through the grinders, and if they're tired and exhausted, often an arm went there too. And then it's very hot while you boil it, and they had African sugar chemists, they called them, because they knew exactly when it was right to process that sugar, and it was just a grueling kind of labor. If you were lucky, you might work in other areas of the economy. You could be making the carts, you could be tending the animals, you could be doing other things, but if you're one of those men and sometimes women in those fields, it's just gruesome. And so it is really the worst. And then there's times when sugar is gone, and they call it dead time, tiempo muerte, and in that time then slaves were used in other kinds of labor if you made it through the sugar season. But it's bad.
Did slavery last longer
Well, it doesn't really, it's a good question. 1886 is Cuba, 1888 is Brazil, the final. In Spain, I never looked to see when they actually did it. But it wasn't this kind of slavery. It wasn't plantations anyway. It was minor slavery, domestic slavery. That's a good question. I'm going to have to go back and see if they actually put it on the books. If you remember sort of our Spanish history, Napoleon marches in to Spain and Portugal, and the Spanish government has to go on the run because he's taken the king's hostage, right? So in that time they're on the run, there's a liberal moment in which they try to ameliorate slavery from Spain. And there are certain rights that are offered under the Constitution of 1812 that are immediately revoked when the King of Spain gets out of jail. Napoleon's defeated and the king gets out, and he comes back with a vengeance and says, no, we're back in our old mode. So there were attempts to soften it from Spain, but I can't tell you an exact date. I'll have to go look it up.
I have the answer to your slavery thing
To which one?
in Spain.
Oh, thank you. What is it?
1542, Spain enacted the first European law abolishing colonies.
I'm sorry, but that's the new laws. Yeah, no, that's about Indians, and that doesn't really even get rid of Indian slavery, but that's a good, but it shows you one of the points that we were trying to make, that Spain had this legal tradition in which everybody could have access and voice, and that they debate these issues about who's human, who's not, who gets a soul, who needs converted, and that the laws that you were referring to are a result of all the complaints of the abuse of Indian slaves, and then they say, after a big debate in Spain, yes, they're human, yes, they deserve to be converted, and they shouldn't be abused, and they can't be commended over generations in slavery.
1811, excuse me, I won't interrupt.
1811, they said Spain. Okay, so that's in that liberal moment on the run, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's reinstituted after the absolutists come back, and then has a second life, I bet.
Mr. Eakin can tell us more about this, but I just came from Brazil, and when Napoleon came into Portugal, the royalty moved all the way to Brazil.
Yeah, they got out the back door, and yeah, and that's the only example I know of that, where everything's transplanted. Yeah, and Marshall will do Brazil for us later, aren't you? Next week, okay. Yeah, good. But the Portuguese also had not had much experience with a large slave force until they get colonies, and that's going to make it different. What other questions?
You know about the Melungeons in the Appalachian region? Are they tied into this at all?
Well, it's a good example of that racial mixture that you're talking about, and so there are all sorts of ideas about supposed Africans and supposed Indian Portuguese people and so on, making the Melungeon mixed race group in North Carolina. And there's a group of aficionados who study that, and I don't know if I've been convinced one way or the other. I don't know that Portugal actually hit North Carolina, but maybe. But there are a lot of examples like that. The Lumbees were another group that I mentioned that have that mixture, and so all the southeastern groups do. Yes.
You implied the Spanish encouraged marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Was it also true that the slave owner couldn't split up a family and sell off parts of families?
That is true, and it doesn't mean it doesn't happen occasionally, but it is protested if they try it, and it's not supposed to happen at all. And so I have many cases where somebody will come in and say, so-and-so is trying to take my wife off to Cuba, and they always side. The priests will always come in on that and always back the rights of, there are conjugal rights even if you don't live together. And we'll track someone who would be free in my little settlement of Mose who has an African wife, but their children born every year and baptized every year, and they're married legally, and they're allowed conjugal rights. So yes, you're not supposed to, that's another big difference I should have put up between the chattel idea. Because if you're nothing but a piece of property, you don't have sentiment about your family.
Follow, are children then considered slaves or not?
Children do follow the condition of their mother, so that was something that did come true. like the English system. But in many cases, you know, it costs money for a slave owner to raise a child, and often they would take an offer from either the father or anybody interested to manumit that child even in the womb for a very small price, because the baby might be born or might not, or even at birth and at the baptism there were these very often manumitted babies. But they would have been born, if their mother was a slave, they would have been a slave, but usually the fathers would try to buy their freedom almost right away, and if it took longer, they took longer. Oh, I'm sorry, to free, just legally free, to go down to the court and say, you know, I either gratis, freely give this person their freedom papers, or they paid for it and I'm freeing them, or the state could free them. So manumission is just freedom, granting of freedom. I'm sorry. Yes?
Considering the history of the slavery was different in South America and North America, is there a difference through the years in racial prejudice between South America and North America?
Well, you know, that's a hard thing to measure, but I'll back up a little bit and just say Spanish America was half of the United States to the whole bottom tier of this. So many laws and customs lasted until later than you might think. For instance, you know, the Spanish didn't give up Florida till 1821. They gave up Louisiana earlier, but you know, there's a lot of that remains. How you judge prejudice, I would say, just from living in South America and working in South America so long, everybody's so mixed up that it's more possible. But it's been slow for Africans to have the prominence they deserved in the history, even in those areas. But certainly, if you consider that our history took the idea that people were nothing more than a piece of property, and that it took a civil war to finally change all of that, I would say we have more to make up for. But it's hard to measure. I mean, Paul?
Was there a difference in status between the African slave and the indigenous population that they enslaved?
Well, that's a good question, too. I think in the beginning, they worked in a lot of the same occupations, and they were in the same sort of conditions. The indigenous people were considered weaker because they were vulnerable to the pathogens Europeans brought as a virgin population, so they tended to, you know, there was a huge drop-off by the 17th century of their populations. Those that recovered then had some immunities, but they always had this idea in written things that I've read that it took 4 Indian slaves to make the labor of 1 African slave. So they had these imaginary ideas about the strength and weakness, and so they might have somewhat coddled more, and that's a terrible way to put it, but I mean they might have been more fearful of losing the lives of the indigenous because they were considered weaker. But and then as of 1542 you weren't supposed to be doing it anymore anyway. But African imports continued all the way up until the end. And even after supposedly Great Britain becomes abolitionist, after they became industrial, then they felt they could give up slavery. And then they try to make everybody else give it up. And they begin to, you know, ply the seas with their navies to stop the slave trade that was pouring into Brazil and Cuba. But even though they're manning it, and there's a small American squadron too, a small navy of Americans trying to intercept it, slaves continue to pour in right up in the U.S. to our Civil War. So you can think about Africans being introduced in culture and other customs that you may not be aware of. They're sort of filtered through the South, so they get blended in with Creole, what they call Creole populations born here. Bill?
The African slave squadrons, the British and American, were very, very small. And the African coast is a lot of places to hide and skip, though the punishments were severe. The profits on the post-slave trade traffic were enormous.
Yeah, I think they knew that the jig was up, jig or gig, is it? Which is it in English? Okay. And so they're going to be crueler, pack more people in. They would hit the coast of Cuba in some of those little hidden places, and then burn the ships and march people inland, and happens in Brazil and Cuba. And it happens in the U.S. So there are a lot of these last slave ship books now out called, there's one, The Clotilde, about Alabama, The Wanderer, about one that lands on Jekyll's Island in the 1850s. And so they keep finding more and more last slave ships that come in. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate your attention, and next week we're going to have Marshall, and he tells me it's Brazil next week, is it? Okay. So I'll be around if anybody wants to email and ask any questions that come up after. I'll be glad to try to answer them. And I hope you go to St. Augustine.